Welcome to Cato. I'm Adam Omary, a psychologist and research fellow on the Human Progress team here at Cato. I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Rebecca Newberger Goldstein. Rebecca is a philosopher, novelist, and the recipient of many awards for her many books, including the National Humanities Medal awarded in 2014 by President Obama and a MacArthur Genius Fellowship. Her most recent book, which we'll be discussing today, is The Mattering Instinct: How Our Deepest Longing Drives Us and Divides Us. Cato audiences are accustomed to book forums about government and policy research, but the crisis of meaning that many people are experiencing across the political spectrum is, in a sense, upstream of all these questions. Rates of depression and anxiety have surged across the West, particularly among young people. Deaths of despair have more than doubled in the past 2 decades in the United States, and polls consistently find large shares of adults in wealthy democracies saying their lives lack purpose. Before we can debate which policies best serve human flourishing, we need to understand what flourishing actually requires psychologically. What drives people to build, create, and cooperate, and what drives them into the tribalism and zero-sum conflicts that threaten liberty and peaceful coexistence. Rebecca Goldstein's The Mattering Instinct offers one of the most ambitious frameworks for answering that question. It draws on evolutionary biology, philosophy, physics, and psychology to argue that the uniquely human longing to matter is the source of both our greatest progress and our deepest divisions, with profound implications for how we think about defending civil liberties. Rebecca and I are going to speak about her book for about 40 minutes, and we'll have about 20 minutes for audience questions at the end, followed by lunch upstairs and a book signing. Rebecca, welcome to Cato. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be on stage with Adam, who is, I can say, one of the most impressive people who's passed through Harvard in the last few years. A tremendous scope of interest and erudition. So I am honored to be on stage with him.
Thank you, Rebecca. You argue that the mattering instinct, the uniquely human need to feel that our lives hold genuine significance, is the engine behind both extraordinary creation and extraordinary destruction. Walk us through that duality. How does the same instinct produce both innovation, care, and creative achievement on one side, and tribalism, ideological extremism, and zero-sum conflict on the other?
I guess the short answer to that is because I argue that it's the very core of our humanness, of our humanity, of our being human, that we are creatures of matter who long to matter. And if it is, in fact, as core as I argue it to be, it's not surprising that it would give rise to great achievements, because certainly our species has produced great achievements and great atrocities, because our species has also produced great atrocities. Maybe I should say something about what I mean by the mattering instinct, because I've found in talking to people, it's not intuitively obvious. And in fact, how one personally responds to the mattering instinct, which is across our species with radical and irreducible diversity, the way that one responds to it often determines how you actually hear this word, mattering instinct, or the longing to matter. We'll get onto those various ways. But what I actually mean by it is I don't necessarily mean mattering to others, although mattering to others is often important in how we respond to it. Mattering to others has to do with our relationships with others. The mattering instinct, as I define it, has to do with our relationship with ourselves, not intrinsically our relationships with others. Relationships with ourselves, basically being reconciled to living the life that we do, to who we are, to our identity. And it is, has to do with our longing to justify ourselves in our own eyes. And we use terms like purpose or meaningfulness, living a meaningful life in one's own eyes. It's this kind of existential, intrinsically personal longing that I'm talking about in talking about the longing to matter. I don't know if that's clear enough yet.
And how does that personal aspect also develop into tribalism and the types of group conflict that paradoxically people do find meaningful? It's destructive, and yet it's a product of the mattering instinct as well.
Yeah. So there are these various strategies that people use in order to try to realize, to minister, to satisfy this longing to matter, not to have one's one and only life be a waste. I mean, just mattering, by the way, I perhaps should say, how I understand this term. It means, I believe, deserving of attention. And we have to pay ourselves, by the very laws of nature that have made us, a tremendous amount of attention. It's wired into our brains to pay ourselves a tremendous amount. It's a very complicated thing to lead a human life. It takes a tremendous amount of attention. Attention evolved in order to, it's an adaptive evolution, attention, and helps us get things out of our environment, food, stay away from predators. It's self-referential, the whole adaptation of attention. And of course, we pay ourselves a tremendous amount of attention. But we are able, we alone of all the species, with these incredibly complicated brains that we've evolved for other purposes, not for this purpose, but it's a kind of spandrel, that we have developed the adaptation of self-reflection. We can step outside of ourselves. It gives us some distance from ourselves. We can interrogate ourselves in the way we interrogate other people, study, probe. That's what therapy is all about. And one of the things that we become extremely aware of is just how much attention we pay to ourselves. And that is a kind of, it's what the existentialists had spoken about as the absurd, when you step outside of yourself and you see the arbitrariness of all the attention that you pay to yourself, and you ask why. In what sense am I deserving of all this? It's this kind of self-reflection that gives rise to what I call the mattering instinct, the way that turns us into the justificatory creatures that we are, asking these questions of justification, most fundamentally justification for our own self-mattering. The way we go about responding to this can be creatively, it can be destructively. I mean, the most destructive cases that one can see are when you see it in the privation of any way to respond to it. People who feel that they don't matter, that there's no way that they can matter. You see this in depression. And in fact, the suicide hotline in the US is www.youmatter.gov, which is kind of extraordinary. It sort of shows what can happen if a person has no way of trying to, that's what depression is, no way of feeling that they matter. And another place that one can see it is in random acts of violence. I spent a really long time reading all of the manifestos that are left behind by those who, and they do tend to leave manifestos, either videos or written statements behind of, what motivated them to this. It's a dark read, I can tell you, and over and over again, what's repeated is, I don't matter. You will soon know the Parkland, Florida mass murderer. You will soon know my name. You will count. You will he didn't use fancy language, but you will basically bifurcate your lives to the before I appeared on the scene and the after. I mean, this sort of deep privation of a sense of mattering that can drive people to, either depression or extremes of violence. These are in the most extremes. The other way, I'm only talking about the dark side. We'll get to the lighter, more creative side later. Another way that one sees, the dark side unfurling from this is from ideologies that often minister to those, again, who are not feeling as if they have any way of mattering, their ways of mattering, or to undermine the mattering of others. Some of the greatest atrocities in human history, genocide, things of this sort, stem from this kind of thing. In the book, I profile somebody I came to know, a neo-Nazi skinhead. I went to great lengths to try to get to know a neo-Nazi skinhead. For some reason, sending out these feelers, nobody got back to somebody named Rebecca Newberger Goldstein. There was not great alacrity in responding to my emails, but I did find somebody. He was an ex-neo-Nazi skinhead. And indeed, I had one of the deepest conversations with him about what can happen when your longing to matter is not satisfied in the normal ways, and the kind of ideology of that can feed this. He said, when he did first meet this big guy who had a terrible background, when he met some of these neo-Nazis, and they said, look into the mirror, what you will see is somebody who matters so much more than others. You are a white, male, heterosexual American. These others are taking your mattering away from you. So there are so many ways in which it can come up in dark ways. Why am I only talking about the dark ways? Well, we'll talk about the creative ways of ministering to the mattering instinct as well.
And this privation that you talk about, it's a very specific type that speaks to a paradox at the heart of my work on psychology of progress. At humanprogress.org, we track the empirical evidence of human progress, rising life expectancy, falling disease rates, cheaper and more abundant goods and services. By almost every measurable standard, the world is better than it's ever been. Yet you argue that material abundance alone cannot satisfy the longing to matter. Why not? What is it about the mattering instinct that is so immaterially irreducible?
Yeah, well, it does work for some people, the material wealth, those whose mattering is based on their wealth, and who feel they matter more and more the wealthier they are. It is this deeply existential inner longing, and the fact that material success doesn't necessarily do the trick. Actually, one of the best ways of seeing that is to go back to when I think this longing to matter really made itself felt in the history of humanity, that we can actually pinpoint when you weren't expecting this. I'm going to bring up the axial age. Were you expecting this? No. But that there was a time in history where you can actually see this existential dimension emerging, and we call it the axial age. It's basically 800 to 200 BCE. And it was an existentialist philosopher. I don't, by the way, identify as an existentialist philosopher, but yet they knew some things, those existentialist philosophers. It was an existentialist philosopher, a German philosopher, Karl Jaspers, 20th century philosopher, who first noticed something really fascinating, which is that all of the religions that are extant into our day, as well as Western philosophy, all emerged in the same period of time, basically 800 to 200 BCE, with the 6th century BCE being sort of the pinnacle of the axial age. But Confucianism, Taoism, Jainism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, the first Abrahamic religion. There are some other
Lots of
iterations.
transcenders.
Yeah, lots of what I call transcenders, yes. And Western philosophy, the one secular response to this. They all emerge at all these normative frameworks, value-leading frameworks, all emerge in the same moment. What does this have to do with material progress? Researchers have shown the names, Pascal Boyer and Nicolas Baumar, two social scientists, have shown that all of the areas of the globe that participated in the axial age, China, India, Persia, the Jain Hills, whatever you want to call them, and into Europe by way of the Greeks, all had the highest caloric intake. They were all the most well-fed. They also had a scholarly class. They had some literacy and some stability. And it's at that point that people stop worrying just about surviving to see another dawn, and these questions of value, existential questions. What am I surviving for? What is my life supposed to be about? Is there something I'm supposed to be? Is there something I'm supposed to achieve? And so you have this great burgeoning of the value systems that persist to our own day, one way or another. All of us can trace our value system, back to that time. So that in itself kind of shows that, it's a certain level of material well-being that allows us to even start thinking about these self-reflective questions. I mean, when we're scurrying for life, putting everything into just surviving and having ourselves and our kin, our tribe survive, you're not thinking, what am I surviving for? But that's a kind of answer to this question, and still we find this persists. I mean, the poorest countries have the lowest sense of well-being, but the best off countries don't necessarily have the highest sense of well-being and life satisfaction. And so they're related, but it's not reducible. The one is not reducible to the other.
This cross-cultural diversity and different systems of value is a good segue into what you termed the mattering map. Rebecca, you've literally mapped out these immaterial sources of meaning on the screen behind us. Walk us through this mattering map, including how it came into being.
That story, how it came into being? Well, maybe I'll get to that, but Yeah, so I've been doing research on this informally for a very long time. I didn't, okay, maybe I'll talk about how it came into being. I was trained as a philosopher of science, philosopher of math, and you know, I became an academic to do that. But while I was still an untenured, very young assistant professor of philosophy, this novel came to me, a work of fiction came to me, just sort of out of the blue when I was getting ready one morning for work, came to me. I've heard the first line. It wasn't in my voice. I knew it was. Well, either I was transitioning from neurotic to psychotic, hearing voices in my head, or this was the first line of a novel, and I chose to interpret it as the latter. And I wrote it because it was there. It was there to be written, and it was, you know, and it was acquired by an editor. And the first question that the editor asked me was, your heroine has so much going for her. She's very bright, she's very funny, she's very sexually desirable, blah, blah, blah. And she's so unhappy. She's always on the cusp of despair. Why? What's eating her? And I thought and thought about it, and I could hear it. I could hear it in the very first line that she delivered to me, which is, I'm often asked what it's like to be married to a genius. I could hear her discontent. I thought and thought about it, and then she answered in her voice. One of the coolest things about writing novels is you hear your characters talking. And she said, because I don't matter in the way that most matters to me. And I thought, this idea was so interesting to me that, you know, it already had this, the germ of this idea that we long to matter, and that there's a great diversity of ways of ministering to this longing. And it has to be, you know, to live a contented life, a flourishing life, you have to feel that you matter in the way that most matters to you. And so I began to think about the various ways that people have of, you know, wrote the novel, published it. It was a huge bestseller, surprisingly enough. My colleagues hated that. And but I began to talk to as many people as I possibly could of all different types. If you sat next to me on a long bus ride and you wanted to talk, we would end up talking about mattering, formed this notion of the mattering map. And she formed the notion, or it was a collaboration, my character and I formed this notion of the mattering map. But I had no idea really of this sort of thing. Talking to people, reading as much as I could in psychology, evolutionary psychology, biographies, and talking to people, informally interviewing them, I guess, just because it's such a fascinating subject to me. I came up with that there are 4 basic strategies that people utilize in trying to satisfy their longing to matter. So transcenders, when I asked AI, you know, these sizes are approximate, but I did it, Claude helped me out here, and the sizes here and the proportions. There are the transcenders who are basically, have a religious or spiritual way of trying to satisfy their longing to matter, that it usually involves some sort of metaphysical belief in a transcendent being outside of direct empirical experience, whether it's called God or something vaguer, more spiritual, but that, you know, that one matters to that spiritual, that religious being, and therefore matters. And this is, you know, a common theme in most religious and spiritual points of view. So these are people who feel that it's a very strong sense of mattering, right? You matter to that which created the universe, the laws of nature without, and the moral order within. That you have a role to play in the narrative of eternity. This is a very kind of cosmic sense of mattering. I was born into such a way of thinking. It didn't stick, but I know what it feels like, and it is a very robust sense of mattering. When I did something considered sinful in my religion, I felt that God Almighty was taking note and judging me. Terrifying, but also never doubt one's sense of mattering. Very robust form of sense of mattering. Most people I speak to were socializers. They understood the question of mattering as mattering to others. The others might be one's intimates, the people who are in one's life, one's family, friends, lovers, neighbors, coworkers, community members. It could be complete strangers. So, for example, many millennials I've spoken to, when I speak about what will make them feel that they matter, they want to be famous. They want to be influencers. And so to be famous means to matter to a bunch of strangers, basically, is what it means. One cynic defined it. To be famous is to be paid attention to a lot of people that the famous person is happy he needn't pay any attention to. Cynical kind of definition of fame. But that way of trying to minister to one's mattering instinct. Heroic strivers, people who have some sort of standards of excellence that they want to realize, or at least asymptotically approach, get closer and closer to. Could be intellectual, it could be artistic, could be athletic, could be ethical. One of the people I profile in the book is Baba Amte, who was an ethical striver. He set about trying to wipe out tuberculosis in his native India. He did tremendous work, an atheist. In fact, he so disliked religion, he would never allow a priest into his house. But a kind of saint. That's what a saint is, an ethical striver. And last of all, competitors. So some people hear this question about mattering as, do I matter more than others? And this can be done sort of individually. They want to matter more than other individuals, or does one's group matter more than others? So the neo-Nazi who is now actually a close friend of mine, the ex-neo-Nazi who is now a close friend of mine, I should say, he had this kind of group competitiveness. He was going to put the mattering order back to rights. His kind ought to be seen as mattering more than my kind, and so those are the four types, and those are divided into so many different regions. The amount of creativity that our species has poured into answering the mattering instinct is extraordinary. Achievements, we find them often in the heroic strivers.
People differ fundamentally in how they pursue mattering. Transcenders, socializers, heroic strivers, competitors. People also have this tendency to insist that my way of mattering is what everyone else ought to be doing. And that seems to be at the heart of the polarization and tribalism that we see in our society. So that seems to imply to me that fundamentally we ought to strive for an open and tolerant society where we can allow different ideas and different modes of mattering to exchange and to test and refine each other. So what role does free expression play in allowing different mattering projects to open up and thrive?
Yeah. Yes. That is, I think, the question of our day, this is the, political and sociological and cultural question of our day. Yeah, I call this urge to make one's own way of mattering, to universalize it, the urge to universalize. And, when people think of, transcenders as being particularly guilty of the urge to universalize. After all, I mean, if you're a transcender and you think this is the way reality is, there really is this metaphysical transcendent being, whether people recognize it or not, they're inhabiting that reality. They ought to, notice how we move from is to ought, and they ought to, recognize this transcendent being and act as I think he wants us to act. So, the urge to universalize is very apparent in transcenders, or many transcenders. But I have found it to be present all across the mattering map. That I collect these universalizing statements. I'm not a big collector. I don't know if you've ever been to my house, but it's pretty empty. I don't like physical objects, but I collect these universalizing statements, and it comes almost as naturally to us as the mattering instinct itself. After all, we're staking our lives on our claim as to what we feel makes us matter. We don't want to just feel ourselves so deserving of all this attention that we have to give ourselves just because one is arbitrarily oneself, just as everybody is arbitrarily oneself. We want to feel that there's some kind of justification behind it. But well, if there is a justification behind it, oughtn't it to be the justification for everybody's way of trying to answer the mattering instinct? It's a flawed logic, but it comes so naturally to us. So I have statements from scientists saying everybody ought to be, studying the laws of nature, and statements from mathematicians saying that purpose, Paul Erdős, for example, a famous mathematician, the purpose of life is to propose and to prove. And it's fashion designer who said, Diana Freeland, if you aren't well-dressed, then you're nobody, which means most of my university consists of nobodies. And, that there's a very strong tendency, and I can understand it, to universalize. But this is a mistake. I do think that there are certain rules about mattering. There are better and worse ways. I'm not a moral relativist about this. But this kind of universalizing of one's own mattering region is fallacious and is polarizing. And what was your question?
Well, you also observe that you can't argue someone out of a destructive mattering project, including this reformed extremist that you named. So I think that has strong implications for how we think about censorship and government intervention. If the solution has to come from within rather than be imposed top-down, you can't, well, we ought to try and say we shouldn't be racist extremists, but yeah. in the case of this man that you describe in the book, it wasn't until he adopted a grander and more tolerant sense of meaning that he actually felt inspired to change his ways, right? So what does that suggest about any attempts to mandate values or enforce speech? How do we invite people to the sort of tolerance and positive mattering projects?
Yeah. So now I remember your real question there, and it was about pluralism, right? Which mattering pluralism, which is, which I think is extremely important. That first line that character had said to me, I don't matter in the way that most matters to me. there is, it's an ethical truth that in some moral sense, and I can argue it philosophically, it's a moral sense, we all matter, that there is something about being human that makes us vessels of some kind of intrinsic mattering. We speak about the intrinsic dignity of human life. I think that we're gesturing towards that sort of thing, a sort of intrinsic mattering that simply comes, I would say, from actually being the kind of creatures who need to justify ourselves in our own eyes. I think that's really, that is dignified. There's something noble about that. There's something estimable about that. I'm not dissing other species. I'm a great lover of other species. But there's this extra burden that we take on in being human, this self-justificatory burden that we take on in being human, which I think is speaks to the intrinsic mattering of each of us. But we have to do it in I'm going to sound very individualist here, and there are moral guidelines, but in general, it has to come out of our individuality. It can't be mandated to us, not by government, not by institutions, not by our culture, not by the marketplace, even. And it's because I'm going to try out, I told you I have a sort of argument that I've never aired, and it's not fully fleshed out, but I thought if there was any audience that might be receptive to it, it would be this one, because it takes the argument of Hayek as a kind of model and applying it to mattering. And what one ends up with is this idea of mattering pluralism and no mattering commissar who's going to mandate how we're going to go about ministering to this deep core human instinct. So, okay, I'm going to, with some trepidation, try this out. So, of course, you know, Hayek had argued the knowledge problem, that there can't be some commissar who's going to decide on production and allocation, because the knowledge that one needs to be able to do that is dispersed, it's tacit, it's context-bound, and it's dynamic, it's ever-changing. And so the best way to aggregate all of this knowledge, and I'm sure this is all terrifically familiar to everybody here, the best way to aggregate this is through the market, that this is a way of aggregating all of this knowledge. It signals what's needed, where it's needed, how to allocate it, how to produce it. Okay, so analogously, I'm going to argue, there is a kind of mattering knowledge problem, and that there is the local first-person knowledge that is scattered among all human beings, all of whom, you know, long for their life not to be a waste, as long as, you know, a certain stability and, you know, material well-being is in place, that this, as we see in the axial age, this existential longing is unleashed. And this knowledge, this local first-person knowledge of what it is to matter is dispersed. It's tacit. People can't, you know, really verbalize what exactly it is, that how they, you know, what matters to them, how they go about trying to explain this. And it is context-bound. It's bound up with one's, you know, one's biography, one's history, one's culture, one's temperament, one's talents, one's interests, opportunities, trauma. It's an extremely detailed amount of knowledge that only the individual themselves has. And, most importantly, it's dynamic, it's ever-changing. I was born a transgender. I lived as a transgender for many years. I became a non-transgender. I became a heroic striver. It's constantly, and we learn about it by living our lives, trying things out, adapting, learning from others. It's dynamic. And, so any kind of mattering commissar, whether it's, the government or institutions of any sort, can't possibly have the knowledge that's relevant for telling anybody how to live. Let 100 or whatever number, mattering projects bloom. And if we let people do it themselves, they're going to come up with creative and new mattering projects that people, that answer to themselves that nobody could have predicted. Like being an analytic philosopher who becomes an existentialist and writes novels. I mean, my institution certainly didn't want that. But that was what I needed, to live a life that's flourishing. So this is a kind of Hayek analogous argument for why there must be great pluralism in our mattering projects, and to beware of any segment that tries to impose its view of how we ought to be living meaningful lives, not wasting our lives on us. Does that work?
This free market of mattering, it also connects really nicely to something you talk a lot about in your book, which is entropy. I mentioned there's physics in the mattering instinct. So entropy, the global law that everything trends towards decay, you argue that our sense of mattering is intrinsically tied to resisting that decay in the struggle to stay alive, to maintain our bodies, to maintain our social relationships, to maintain our institutions. In any of these cases, the default state of things is decay, and it takes work and effort to maintain them, to resist entropy. And in this system that you're describing, so the premise there, and that you flesh this out in your book, is that one thing that's inherently meaningful is order against disorder. And one form of disorder is complexity, which includes these types of convoluted systems, basically anything that isn't the free market that you're talking about, not just economic, but in terms of freedom to pursue different ideas. There's also an evolutionary logic to it, and you describe a lot of evolutionary biology and psychology in your book. This natural selection or cultural selection mechanism of different ideas can fight each other, and the best ones will win, and we allow the bad ideas to die off. So if we maintain enough freedom and flexibility, then we can have this upward spiral towards better mattering projects, better innovation. But a necessary precondition to that is the freedom to have trial and error.
Yeah. So, I should say, this idea of mine that I, to my great delight, realized had an analog in Hayek's economic views, to which I've always been much inclined, also is bolstered by John Stuart Mill's Experiments in Living, which is something that you're sort of alluding to, that he talks about on Liberty, that there has to be, it is for all of us to experiment with our own lives, given our own everything that we all bring, the precious uniqueness that we all bring to this difficult burden that we set ourselves in being human. So, and should we talk a little bit about entropy? Because it is, in fact, when I said that, I do think that there has to be this great pluralism, mattering pluralism, and that we should very much resist anybody telling us this is the right way, anything else is a waste. This is the noble way, anything else is ignoble. But that I'm not a moral relativist. I don't think, that there are certain moral guidelines here. Some mattering projects are better than others. That my neo-Nazi friend did well when he forsook his ideology for what he's doing now, which is basically to do penance for the first part of his life. It's really one of the most moving stories I have a lot of moving stories that I couldn't get them all into the book, but I do get quite a few of them into the book. Very moving stories about how people change over time and what they do in responding to the mattering instinct. So there are better and worse ways. Now, which I go into a lot of detail about entropy and the second law of thermodynamics and the way in which life, in fact, all the laws of biology, are a response to the second law of thermodynamics. And it's really, and then when I saw that as a graduate student, that, oh my God, all of biology actually comes out of responding to the second law of thermodynamics. I was so excited in the way of a graduate student. And I think, does anybody know this? Does anybody, I've got to let the world know. And then I read Schrodinger's What is Life? And Schrodinger being a great physicist, he had figured it out before me, as had many others. But it is a very deep insight about what life is. Life is, we have to take in a tremendous amount of energy in order to maintain all of the order that life is, the low entropy. Entropy means disorder. And entropy, that word itself actually means transformation from within. That's what we're always fighting. That's what life is always fighting, the transformation from within. It takes a tremendous amount of energy, and of course the big energy guzzler for us is this brain. I think it did, it takes, even though it's very, I can't remember.
Something like 3% of our weight, but
20% of our energy. 20% of our energy. It's 2 or 3% of our weight, and it's probably more in my case because I'm so slight. Anyway, so that's what life is, and I think as a sort of guideline, I think that our human effect. The mattering projects that we take up and try out, sometimes trade in for other ones. The best way to judge them and the best way that I come around to judging life, human lives, are the effect of entropy, on entropy. Is one working in the direction of entropy, hastening destruction, decay, chaos, or is one allied with life and flourishing in its resistance to entropy? And it seems to me that many of the things that are best worth living for are the things that demand a great deal of order. And so the resistance to energy, to entropy, is that much greater. Knowledge is better than ignorance. Clarity is better than confusion. Flourishing is better than suffering and sickness. Kindness is better than cruelty. Beauty is better than ugliness. These truisms, in all of these cases, the thing that is better than is an ordered state, that to value these things, to have them in mind in one's mattering project, is to ally oneself with the resistance to entropy, rather than helping entropy along. And one can look at various people and think, would there be more or less entropy if they weren't around, or if they changed their ways? And to me, this something that captures our intuitive notion of what it is to live a good life, or a not so good life.
That's a great segue, and to close with this, of our mission at Cato of defending civil liberties. As you just elaborated, the natural state of things, and this applies to our institutions as well, is decay. So we have to constantly, taking this up as a mattering project, resist that force of entropy and choose these healthier mattering projects aligned with life and flourishing, those that resist entropy and uphold order. So many people at Cato, many people in this room have organized their lives around defending peace and liberty, but the very nature of that mattering project is one that's never completed. What advice do you have for us?
Keep at it. Nothing could be more important than freedom, the freedom of all people to be able, within the moral guidelines, not undermining other people's right to matter. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of mattering, I would say, is what our founders really had in mind. Happiness is shallow, but happiness comes and goes. But mattering is something truly worth pursuing. It's what we need to pursue. It's in our human nature. All power to us. All respect to us. It's very easy for me, and I'm sure many of you, all of us who are living right now in very, very divided times, to be horrified by our species. And constantly, you open up the newspaper and you're horrified. And for me, it's almost like a Zen, ritual. When I'm now, it's sort of, I go through this again and remember how difficult it is to be human, the extra burden we take on being human. Yes, we get it very, very wrong. It can go, and it's important to know how it can go wrong. It's important to see how it goes wrong, so that perhaps we can fight it. We know how to change ourselves and others. But it's also important to keep in mind the humanness, even in the people who are horrifying us at the moment. Here's one piece of, so yes, peace and liberty, yes, there could be nothing more life-affirming, anti-entropic, counter-entropic that I can think of. There is one thing that I would caution about, and I hope I'm not overstepping myself here, but there is a tendency, and we all have it, to feel that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the enemy of our enemies may not be our friends, and this happens certainly on the left, but it happens on the right as well. And so, I would be wary of we who so believe in peace and liberty allying ourselves with certain areas of the right which would claim to mandate how we ought to all pursue our mattering. And I am very, very concerned about the rise of Christian nationalism in particular. And that is, in fact, an ideology that would tell us, how we ought to be pursuing our mattering, what it is to live a worthwhile and noble life, how we ought to conduct ourselves in our personal lives. And so that is the one piece of advice I would offer to beware of that, and to remember the core, I think, of what Cato is about, which is really freedom, projects of freedom, personal freedom, and peace.
Thank you, Rebecca. Now we have time for questions. We have lunch after this, and if we eat into some of that lunchtime, we can still have 20 minutes for questions, and I'd love to prioritize audience questions, so we'll get started. We have microphones that'll be brought to people asking questions. Please introduce yourself, be concise, resist entropy in your question, make sure it's actually a question.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your discussion about the mattering instinct very well. It gets to the core of our being. I wonder if there's, I found a relationship I couldn't help thinking about right away at the start of a character in a famous American play, The Death of a Salesman, when he's suffering a breakdown, depression because his children don't respect what he did, and her famous speech is, "Attention must be paid to this man." Is there a relationship to what you're talking about?
Yes, yes. In fact, thank you very, very much. In one of the earlier drafts of this book that went through more drafts than I care to think about, I quote that line: "Attention must be paid." I mean, in fact, attention must be paid is coming to each and every one of us, and the dearth of attention to people is, a tragedy in itself, and has, because of the depth of what it is to be human, of this core longing, can have terrible consequences, and unforeseen consequences. It makes people, either extremely depressed, or it can make them violent, and it can make them ripe for demagogues to appeal to. So anybody. I had a very good friend in college who suffered very much from depression, and she became a cult member, and she was lost to me and lost to everybody after that. But it was that that sense of here is a cult leader who, according to my friend, existed on a higher plane of mattering, and there was kind of trickle-down mattering that fell on all the followers. So yeah, but yes, this is so. It's actually interesting. I mean, you picked out a perfect line from Death of a Salesman: "Attention must be paid." But that is, in fact, it could be universalized. That is a statement that could be universalized. Attention must be paid to each and every one of us. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so very much for your wonderful presentation. And I just wanted to touch on something that impacts particularly my generation or younger workers, is this kind of feeling that we're moving into a post-mattering in work and labor as a value. A great fear, whether or not it'll be realized or not, is the idea that AI will displace the worker, and because so much, at least in America, of our self-worth is in our labor and our work and how we can provide, where do you see this occurring in the future? And if it should, how will our mattering change in a world where work is no longer the most important thing that a human can do?
Yeah, all right, it's a really deep question. First of all, it's sort of two questions, because we're already, as you alluded to, we're already in a state in many corporations in which workers are made to feel fungible. I can't remember exactly how I put it, but it's sort of like a snack machine, that endlessly restockable, you can, where you're exchangeable. And since, yes, we all spend a lot of time at workplaces, this feeling of just being interchangeable, that you don't matter, there's more like you coming, and for all we care, you don't really matter. This is terrible. It just can't lead to good feelings, and so it is something. I've been actually asked to speak to a lot of corporations, and it is, how can the corporation change in a way so that we have happy people working there? And the most important thing is for people to feel that they're not fungible. They can be exchanged just for the next one waiting for a job. And that's already, upon us, that so many people feel like that. It hasn't, until quite recently, reached what we call the knowledge workers. People like you and like me, but AI is bringing it home, and I just hear this in academia all the time. I just came from a philosophy conference, and all the talk was about whether or not philosophers are going to be replaced by machines that can think better and faster than we can, and it's an interesting question, and I think not. I think that there's as I was saying to Adam earlier, I guess I think about it mostly in terms of philosophy because that's my academic field, but there's an awful lot of junk that's produced in academia. You have to publish and you turn out these papers, and now when I read journal articles, I think, could AI have produced this? If yes, well, let AI produce this. Why are humans wasting their time with this? But that there are certain questions that I think that one needs the feel of what it's like to lead a human life in order to be able to understand and to make some headway with. And that if AI takes over all that other stuff, good. Let's get rid of a lot of this junk that should never have been published in the first place. And that's my attitude in any case about so much that's published in academia. But, and let's concentrate, especially in the humanities, which are supposed to be about humans, let's concentrate on the kinds of questions that it takes the feel of what it is to be a human. And I'm constantly testing Claude and ChatGPT, asking them sorts of questions that I think that they can't answer. And they'll tell me that they can't answer it because they don't know what it feels like to be a human. And that's very honest about that. And that's sort of interesting. I mean, maybe those machines someday will know what it does feel like. Maybe they will have subjectivity. Maybe they'll even have the mattering instinct, in which case we will have some non-carbon-based, silicon-based humans on our hands, and we're going to have a lot of ethical questions concerning how they ought to be dealt with, because to be a creature with subjectivity, especially one that is motivated by the mattering instinct, is to have creatures who have certain rights and to whom we have certain obligations. Maybe we should stop before we get to that point.
Thank you, Rebecca. Unfortunately, I'm told we don't have time for more questions here, but we will be convening for lunch upstairs. There are copies of The Mattering Instinct for sale right outside, and Rebecca, I'm sure, will be happy to sign them and answer more questions one-on-one. Please join me in thanking Rebecca Goldstein.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Adam.